podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and welcoming back onto the show, Christiana Zenner. Christiana, thanks so much for making time for us again. Really appreciate it.
Hey Sam, it's awesome to be back. There's a lot of updates happening in
Lots
the
going
world of
on.
religion, climate, ecology.
Yeah. And we talked about it in the episode that you were on, that you have a book project related to Laudato Si, moving beyond Laudato Si, and kind of what's next for Catholicism and Christianity in general and for the world. And there was this update that just came out from Pope Francis called Laudate Deum, Praise God. And so I wanted to have you back on the show to talk about it, figure out what's going on. And it's an update to Laudato Si, but it's not an encyclical. It's an apostolic exhortation. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what this document is.
Sure, happy to. It is not an encyclical. An encyclical has a fairly high authoritative status in the documentary tradition of the Catholic Church. An apostolic exhortation does not have the same status as an encyclical, but it does have some serious clout. And it's intended, in this case, to go to all people of goodwill. In Laudato Si, he addressed it to all people living on the planet, so he may have constrained his parameters a little bit. But I would say that among the differences in this document, it is very exhortatory. So Laudato Si was reflective. Some people called it poetic, certainly theological, wide-ranging. This one is a much more focused, intensive reflection that is meant to have, I think, a pretty immediate and direct impact on behavior, particularly surrounding COP28 and climate denialism.
Yeah, I noticed there was a lot of kind of prefacing COP28, so that's a big part of it, and really hitting climate denialism pretty hard. And because I know that's still an issue, especially with some conservative Catholics in the United States that really don't like Pope Francis, and also are having trouble adjusting to the reality of climate change. So there's a lot of science. There's a lot of talk of politics as well. And so one of the things he's critiquing a lot is what he calls the technocratic paradigm. And so what exactly is he talking about when he's talking about a technocratic paradigm?
Well, one thing that popes can do with relative impunity is make up new terms and deploy them at will. So this is a term that is not new to this particular document. It shows up in Laudate Deum very clearly in its own section, but it takes its origin, at least in part, from Laudato Si, where in Laudato Si, in some of the middle chapters, Pope Francis talks about the what I would call an addictive mentality on the part of some societies, some individuals, but mostly societies, to view technology and economy together as a type of silver bullet or panacea that can solve all the problems of society, of ecological degradation, and so forth. So he thinks of the technocratic paradigm as a value system that values advances in technology and growth of the economy as goods in and of themselves. And he's very, very critical of that. And he, like a lot of degrowthers, we talked about this last time, to some degree, he is very skeptical of an economy as an end in itself. He, I think, would essentially say this is an ideology, this is a problem, and it indicates that values are not being correctly assessed and deployed. So he comes out really strongly on that. And I think it's actually one of the takeaways from this document is that he's foregrounding this now in Catholic social teaching and saying, just in case you missed it before, here is one of the sets of disordered desires that societies are facing.
Yeah, I think that's really big, especially, like politics very polarized in the United States and really globally right now.
Mhm.
But it's one of the things that really the left and the right have in common is this love of technocracy, this idea that like technology growing the economy, well, that's the solution. Then there's just disagreements about exactly how to go about that. So it is deeply rooted in our societies right now. That's a big critique.
It is, and it's this is the second section of the Apostolic Exhortation, Laudate Deum. It's buried deeper in Laudato Si, and so what he says is that the technocratic paradigm is a certain way of understanding human life and activity that has gone awry to the serious detriment of the world around us. And then he says, deep down, it consists in thinking as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power as such. And then he goes on to critique the idea of infinite or unlimited growth and says this proves attractive to economists, financiers, and experts in technology. And then later he goes on to say, and this is also really dangerous because it conduces to the concentration of wealth, power, and technological aptitudes in the hands of a few, but the many are those who pay the price. So I think that it is a challenge, as you're saying, to both the left and right on political spectrums, but also to some degree, religious spectrums, especially in the US Catholic Church, though we can debate that. And he presents it almost as a monstrous disorder, an Ouroboros of sorts. He says the technocratic paradigm monstrously feeds upon itself. And he then goes on to talk about extraction of rare earth minerals and the sorts of things required for production of major technological goods today. It's pretty intense. He's definitely explicit in his language in this exhortation.
Yeah, right. I thought so too. And so much like scientific detail. I mean, he
Yeah.
was, it's definitely not just being like, hey, let's live the simple life. He's going into a lot of the details of the facts of what's going on in our economy and ecology right now.
Yeah, so some of the viewers, listeners, conversation partners may remember that in Laudato Si, he had a couple lines where people were like, "What?" One of which was reduction of air conditioning. Stop using air conditioning. Which, okay, in a warming planet, when people are, vulnerable to heat and so forth, this is a questionable thing to assert. But there are not as many just kind of off the cuff whimsical statements in this exhortation as there are in Laudato Si, partly because it's a lot shorter, but partly because I think he's trying to make a more focused rhetorical effect. And so to that end, he doubles down. Actually, I'm just going to back up and say I read this document as a doubling down on certain key ideas in Laudato Si.
Hmm.
A doubling down, it's concise, and he's putting his moral voice behind them in a way even stronger than in Laudato Si. So it's a concentrated message in that way. And I think we see that happening with regard to the science as well and the scientific citations. So there was absolutely reference to science as a proper mode of human knowledge in Laudato Si, but he didn't get into US style climate denialism, and he didn't get into really detailed scientific citations. Instead, he said, yes, science is a proper power of human creativity and knowledge. And then he went on to identify, six or so indications that our common home is falling into disrepair. In Laudate Deum, Pope Francis just boom, second paragraph, he's right on there with the observation that responses to the encyclical have not been adequate. And let me tell you where, especially, I'm talking about climate, he says. And let me tell you more about what has not been adequate. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. But to your point about science, one of the things he does is he cites the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their recent report. And he even goes so far as to indicate in the footnotes that these consensus documents represent a summary of over 34,000 studies. So he's really making a point about epistemology as well, which is distinctive and I think cool.
Yeah, I thought so. And I'll be curious what the response is from the people who have been really dragging their feet and responding to Laudato Si. Because at some point, I think more scientific facts might not convince people. People have an ideological
Mm,
commitment to avoiding responses to climate change and that kind of aversion to climate solutions. It's like it runs deep. And so I'm not sure, like,
it
how
does
many
run deep.
arguments does it take before people are convinced?
Well, that is the classic knowledge behavior gap,
Yeah.
right? That we can be bombarded with information, and yet if it's, as Dan Kahan and others have shown, if it goes against our sense of identity, it can as you're pointing out, falling on ears that are unwilling to hear. But I think what's interesting about this document is that the Pope is not just saying, hey, the science says this, listen up. He's saying, let me tell you from this perspective of faith as the Pope what the stance is. And P.S., in case you're wondering, the science says this too. So there's a really, in my view, pretty stunning and direct incrimination of the US Catholic Church's failure to engage climate realities in a responsible way. And so I think, again, like in terms of rhetorical strategies, it's pretty brilliant. In paragraph 3, he says this, meaning climate change and the knock-on effects of that. This is a global social issue and one intimately related to the dignity of human life. All right, so that's a theological and moral claim, the
Right.
dignity part. And then he cites the bishops of the United States first, talking in their statement from 2019 on climate change. And then he goes on to diss people who insist on climate denialism, both with facts, but also, I think, more powerfully with a philosophical takedown of their positions, saying you're being really selective in the data you're looking at. The logic doesn't hold up here, and it doesn't hold up here. And then he goes through these other statements in the apostolic exhortation, and then he ends with a throwdown about the United States as well. So it really is this parabolic kind of rhetorical argument that leaves little mystery as to who one of his intended audiences is.
Yeah. Yeah, some of that really felt like this is written not just to people of goodwill, but specifically to people in the United States. And there's always this thing where people will be like, but India, China, they look worry about these other countries.
Yeah.
And he really comes down hard and he's like, well, per capita, the United States is still the worst emitter of carbon emissions by far.
Yeah.
So yeah, the critique of the United States, not just U.S. Catholics or Christians, but United States lifestyles in
Mm-hmm.
general. There's a really big critique of that.
Yeah, there is. And I appreciate that so this is paragraph 72. Um, He says if we consider that emissions per individual in the United States are about 2 times greater than those of individuals living in China and about 7 times greater than the average of the poorest countries, we can state that a broad change in the irresponsible lifestyle connected with the Western model, which I think he sees the US as archetypal of, would have a significant long-term impact. And as a number of folks have pointed out, uh, many of the emissions, not all, but at least a proportion of the emissions in places like China, India, and elsewhere are based on demand for consumer goods from places like the United States. So this is complicated. Simplifications are dangerous, but I think that this is a much more nuanced and thus artful articulation. And it's also, to that end, he's much savvier in this document about the role of international negotiations and the Conference of Parties meetings on climate change. He is less less invested, I think, in this document on exhortations to individuals or about individual conversion or individual action. That's still in there, but this is a much more political document. It's a document of political theology. And so they're just fascinating ways that that comes out.
Yeah, that's a really good point because there was such a big emphasis on ecological conversion in Laudato Si. And while that's still definitely in this document, there's such a big focus on the political side of it and a call for multilateralism, which is complicated to say the least. We have, a very complicated geopolitical situation on the planet right now. But whatever he's referring to as multilateralism, it's not like a one world government because people are always
No.
afraid of that. As soon as you say climate and politics, be like, okay, totalitarian government, here it comes. But it's something a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah, which I think is a useful clarification. Speaking of beyond Laudato Si, what needs to be clarified and where are there areas for growth, non-extractive growth? Um, So in Laudato Si, in chapter 5, he talked about the importance of international coordination and just kind of floated the idea that even some sort of supranational governance system could be developed. This was obviously unwelcome by people who are skeptical of such one world government, totalitarian, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think it seems like he and or his ghostwriters have thought about this a little bit in the interim, and what they're suggesting is what is named as a multilateralism from below, which is a very interesting term. Pope Francis, the Catholic Church before him, have been pretty invested in the United Nations and in international advocacy through that platform for a long time. And this goes back to at least 1972 with addresses on agriculture and other topics. Um, but it is very much the case that what Pope Francis is doing now is also critiquing that mode of international governance. And so he says, he goes through this litany of Conference of Parties. Well, Kyoto, some good things happened there. Look at the Kyoto Protocol. Glasgow, that was a failure. And he says Paris, okay, some steps forward, even though also some non-realized commitments. And then he goes on to say, and at COP28 coming up end of November, December, what we need to see is real action, real commitments, accountability, and a range of other things. So he gives certain kinds of expectations. But even more than that, he says, this probably won't be enough. Because you know what? These sorts of things are where major powers gather. And what happens with major powers? They fall prey to the technocratic paradigm or contentment or loose words without actual commitment. So, one of the things I find most interesting about this document is, again, the specific political commentary that civil society activism is actually essential to these processes. And he goes on and says, he calls this the multilateralism from below. And I will just flip to it here. But this is paragraph 38. He says, the demands that rise up from below throughout the world, where activists from very different countries help and support one another, can end up pressuring the sources of power. It is to be hoped that this will happen with respect to the climate crisis. And elsewhere, he says, sometimes, often, these groups are ridiculed by the people in power or viewed as a nuisance. And what he's saying is, no, this is actually essential because they see what's going on and have a kind of access to moral vernaculars that sometimes the elites have forgotten or that they aren't accountable to. That's pretty liberation theology inspired. That's pretty praxis oriented. I'm here for that.
Yeah, right. It reminds me of the old Catholic social teaching on subsidiarity. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, of course it's from below. And somehow people are like, we'll just ignore that forever. And so, yeah, really nice to hear. Reminds
Yeah.
me of Greta Thunberg at, I forget which COP conference it was, but they invited her to give a talk, and she did
Mm-hmm.
her blah 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 talk. She's like, "Oh,
Totally.
net zero, blah blah blah." It's like you guys just say
Yeah.
things and you don't hold yourselves accountable. There's no realistic goals. There's no real
Yep.
action. It's just blah blah blah, and easy to make fun of, like the school strike for climate and stuff like that, and climate activism or extinction rebellion and things like that. But it's
Mm-hmm.
these are the people who are asking us for real courage and to
Yeah.
really live up to our morals.
Yeah. And I think that that speech in particular would pair very well with this exhortation, kind of on a spectrum of moral leadership on topics of climate. How do different folks deploy language that is spiritually grounded, that is connected to future generations, that critiques technocratic paradigms and extractive capitalism? And how are they received and by whom? Right. And I think this is one reason that people in 2015 with Laudato Si and differently now are also responding to Pope Francis because he's someone who could get people's attention, right? And yeah, I mean the Greta Thunberg line of the fairy tale of the market rings really true with a lot of the critiques in this apostolic exhortation. And it's funny too because it's not like these are necessarily new ideas in Catholic social teaching or even for Pope Francis. In 2013, he released an apostolic exhortation that ended up uh, containing some of the material that was in Laudato Si. And it was right before Thanksgiving, I remember, and a TV producer called and said, "Hey, Pope Francis released this document. Is he a communist?" And I was like, well, so I went on, television, and they were like, "So, is he a communist?" And I was saying, well, he's critiquing excessive market behaviors and idolatry, but that's not the same thing as being a communist straight up, right? Like, is
Yeah.
there room to critique a paradigm without being immediately the polar opposite? I feel like that is a question that is salient in many aspects of the world today, not only economic.
That's true. Yeah. As soon as you critique something, somebody's like, "Oh, so then you're advocating for the
Hmm.
polar opposite."
Hmm.
Like, no, there's got to be some sense of nuance here. Like, no, he's
Yeah.
Catholic, and especially, I mean, so much of communism as we know it with in the 20th century was very productivist, very interested in industrialization, and it's like, well, no, but he's critiquing that as
Hmm.
well. So of
Hmm.
course not. It reminds me of when on Sesame Street during kind of the height of the pandemic, Big Bird advocated getting vaccines, and people said
Oh,
Big Bird's a communist.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like Big Bird's a
Well, maybe Big
communist.
Bird just has an MPH in his downtime.
Yeah, that it could be. I would bet on that. It's like, no, it's not communist. And really, if that's communism, then that's, really not that bad. So I know, people are kind of looking at Marx in a different way in light of some of his later writings, and there's this kind of idea of a degrowth communism, and
Hmm.
so yeah, that's a topic for another day.
It is,
Because
and
yeah,
it is, and I think that one of the things that is very entangled in society at the moment is precisely this question of how do you make moral, philosophical, theological, or ethical nuance without it collapsing into a binary political hate-filled type of discourse. And that is a social problem, it is a media problem, it's also an education problem. And so I appreciate that this podcast and many others are trying to work with that and look at the intellectual conceptual paradigms, the problems with them, the way this can look on the ground, what communities are doing to try to address it, what the unintended consequences are, right? That's how humans and societies learn and move forward. It's it's rare that everything is known in advance. And on Marx, as I say to my students, there are many Karl Marxes,
yeah,
right? Like, the dude wrote a lot, and it just depends on what Marx you're looking at, and
yeah,
so we need to be able to have that conversation with precision. But making an idol of any one person or approach is dangerous.
yeah. And of course, that's a big
Sorry, that was a
reason
little
that
ranty.
liberation theology had such a bad reputation because people thought, oh, this is communist.
Yeah.
And people like Leonardo Boff, who we talked about
Hmm.
last time, of being
Hmm.
suspiciously not cited, even though he's in Laudato Si, even though he's the one who coined the phrase "the cry of the earth" and "the cry of the
Yeah.
poor." And Pope Francis is like, I'm not even mentioning this guy's name.
Yeah.
It's like once you say anything connected to Latin American liberation theology, communist. And like, well,
Yeah.
where's the nuance? And so you can, Pope Francis is clearly very savvy and knows how to talk in a way that avoids that, and yet still getting accused of communism.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, the release of this document came on October 4th, so the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, but it also came at the start of this synod on synodality, which is a term that cracks me up, like a gathering on how we gather. Cool. My committee in my current department used to have a committee on committees, so that's kind of what it feels like. But there's so much going on in terms of the practice of the church, and I think that this will be one type of data point that is a call to action that hopefully people will respond to, and many are. And it just will be interesting to see how that aligns with other
Yep.
responses in the church to the current moment, because the current moment is distinctive.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, speaking of the synod, one of the really big features of it has been Pope Francis including women in new roles. Who, generally it's a gathering of men talking about the church, and he's
Yeah.
like,
Generally,
maybe
they're wearing dresses too, but we'll
that's
skip
an
over that.
important point, really. And finally, he's like, maybe we should listen to women a little, just a little
Hmm.
bit. And so
Hmm.
I think something that surprised both of us with the exhortation was that he did, in fact, cite a woman. Because you had
Hmm.
come up with these wonderful bingo cards, and one of the things on there, one of the boxes was "No women are cited," and I was like,
Yeah.
"That's a gimme. Of course, there's not going to be women
Hmm.
cited." And then, sure enough, he cited a woman. Other things like integral ecology, he didn't say that phrase. The cry of the
Yeah. He
earth, cry of
didn't
the
say cry of the
poor.
earth, cry of the poor.
Yeah, a few
Yeah,
of those other
exactly.
phrases I was
Jinx.
really expecting, and
Same.
yet a woman got cited, and
And not just any woman,
of all women, it was
Donna
Donna Haraway.
Haraway.
Yeah.
Donna Haraway. So yeah, so I 100,000 trillion% want to talk about this. And the Catholic Church is not known as a robustly feminist organization, to put it mildly. I have a
Yeah.
very dry sense of humor. I mean, it's yeah, I don't even need to point out why this is the case. So, in uh, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, I think it was 2014, Pope Francis referred to theologians who were women as the strawberries on the cake of theological reflection. Concomitantly, Catholic social teaching generally doesn't cite women nor engage women's work. And this is a point that I and many other people, generally women, have made throughout, I'm just going to say all of human history. But or at least through the history of Catholic social teaching. And yes, of course, there are a variety of social factors, et cetera, at play in societies and who can be teaching in various capacities and viewed as an authority. But one of the interesting things about the non-citations, both of Leonardo Boff and others in Laudato Si and here, is that there's a really long, strong tradition of ecofeminism within the Catholic Church. And so, ecofeminism, the term, as many listeners know, was coined in 1974 by Françoise d'Aubon and has been developed in many ways. It is not a monolithic notion. I think its strongest forms are anti colonial and intersectional. And Catholic scholars, in particular, I'm just going to lift up Brazilian nun and double PhD, philosophy and religious studies, Ivone Gabarra, have been in situated ways that are also incredibly theoretically nuanced, drawing out many of the themes that the encyclical then names, but without citing sources, and maybe even without recognizing that strawberries have lives outside of being on tops of cakes. Um, so yeah, so I mean, obviously, I have some pretty strong feelings about this, and so that's part of why on that bingo card I was like, "There's no way, no women, zero women cited." I think I actually even put it in all caps on the bingo card. Not everything else was, and and then I was actually reading it a little groggy, sipping a cup of tea at 6:20 in the morning Eastern time. And I'm kind of reading it and I look through the citations as I'm going through and I was like, holy crap, DJ Haraway? That's Donna. That when species meet? Are you kidding me? And so I, as you know, fired off this very what on earth? I did not expect this Twitter thread and a screenshot of citation number 41. And then that took on a life of its own. And Sam, you helpfully added some context from your 2014 book and it was just off and running. National Catholic Reporter has, as of today, October 18th, published a pretty extensive and pretty badass interview profile of Donna Haraway and her thoughts on this particular document. Yeah, so what do you think? I'm interested.
I was really shocked. It was like, of all, I mean, just like to your point, there's so many ecofeminist Catholics who could have been referenced, and instead he mentions somebody who has a Catholic formation, but is very anti-Catholic,
Mhm.
as happens to a lot of Catholics, especially in the United States. And I know a big part of Haraway's reason for not being Catholic is part of it is the patriarchy and misogyny that runs so deep in the tradition,
Mhm.
and but also the way that Catholicism plays into right-wing politics in the United
Yep.
States. So she's like, I can't, with a good conscience, be part of this. And so to cite her, I'm like, of all people, and it wasn't an essential point. It was just this idea from When Species Meet, where she talks about contact zones, and a contact zone is just a kind of space of negotiation where people interact, relate, and all the trouble that comes with relationality. It's very complex.
Mhm.
It's never easy. There's always trouble. We have to stay with that trouble, all that kind of stuff. And so I'm like, you could have said that
Are you
without citing
suggesting
anybody.
that she has a view on staying with the trouble?
Maybe. And so like you didn't need to cite a person to say all the world's related. Like, yeah, you didn't need to cite somebody.
Yeah.
Why cite somebody who's so hostile to Catholicism?
Yeah, and it's, I think that question of, is she hostile, and to Catholicism in what form, right? Because she's clearly deeply opposed philosophically, theologically, ethically, and institutionally to institutional ecclesial formulations of male sacerdotal power, its collusion with politics, and a range of other nefarious outcomes that fall from that, particularly as they relate to women's bodies and ethics, as well as human exceptionalism. And that's kind of a bridge. I think then she's also opposed um, philosophically to ideas of human exceptionalism. And so it's therefore fascinating, as you say, that this reference, as you point out, they're not even quoting her, right? They're referencing a notion that she has talked about. And then footnote 41 is CF DJ Haraway, When Species Meet, this chapter on agility training her dog KN. Shout out to Twitter again, once again, for providing immediately the particular context. So in this interview by Aleha Hertzler McCain, who's done some great work on these topics in National Catholic Reporter, um, she goes on to say this is a totally weird pull, especially given the variety of other things that she's written about and her view on multi-species relations, her critiques of human exceptionalism, and all of this. And so I wrote on Twitter, that first morning, I was like, this is so bizarre given the directionality of Haraway's arguments, even apart from her anti-ecclesial stances, given the directionality of her philosophical arguments, it's just weird, like you said, because there are so many people who could have been cited. Why her? And so I said, I wonder if the Pope or the Vatican actually understand the direction that she's arguing in. And of course, a self-assured respondent was like, I'm quite confident that the Vatican understands the directionality of her arguments. And I was like, do not respond. Do not respond. Um, but it's, Haraway's hypothesis in this interview with Aleha Hertzler McCain is to say that she thinks that there's some baby Jesuit who got interested in reading her language, not mine, baby Jesuit, and then she calls him imaginary baby Jesuit because he's a hypothetical ghostwriter with Pope Francis, who's like, oh, Haraway, look, science studies and expanding species understandings. But again, if it were a robust engagement, then it would require a reconsideration of some of the fundamental anthropological and theological premises, which is the exact same thing that would be required if the Vatican were to cite ecofeminists, right? Because it's not like this stuff is I'm just going to go back to it, strawberry on the cake add-on to the true and existing objective body of knowledge. Like what ecofeminists, including in this case Haraway, are calling for is a recognition that there are epistemic upheavals that happen when you take these claims of interconnection seriously, just like liberation theology. Okay, moving my soapbox to the side now. What do you think?
Well, I 100% agree. And and I'm very curious. I mean, I would imagine if I was that baby Jesuit, I would be like, "Hey, cite Haraway," and so I totally get it. And I don't know, and it's also one of those things where it's like Pope Francis is being very critical of U.S. Politics, U.S. failures to respond to climate change, United States Catholicism, and I'm like, well, then who better to kind of enlist than Haraway
Mm,
because she is such a good
hmm.
critic and because she's not against the sacramentalism of the church and that has deeply informed her understanding of semiotics and culture and this idea that I remember, growing up Catholic around a lot of Protestants in Texas, that people would tell me, well, them going to hell and things like that.
Hmm.
But especially arguments about the idea that the bread is the body, not just
Yep.
represents, but is. And so getting into arguments when I'm like 9 years old or something with people on the bus, and that's one of those things that deeply informs her. And she's like, "Oh yeah, I understand that there is this kind of semioticity of materiality, and the sign is the matter is the sign."
Is the
That's
sign.
so profound and that deeply informs her work. And so in that sense, she's living, a cruciform life. She's following, the teachings of Jesus and but doing it in a way that doesn't have the human exceptionalism of the church, the misogyny of the church. And so you think,
Hmm.
well, here's somebody who's really representing Catholicism at its best and being against the institutional form that has so corrupted the real teaching at the core of it. And so, if you want to critique uh, the kind of conservative, climate denying, misogynistic version of Catholicism, then Haraway's really the Catholic you want on your side. You want like an anti Catholic Catholic. So, in a way, I think that's kind of a smart
Interesting.
move. And to point out, like, hey, there's ways to fight the church while still upholding its core values, and which aren't misogynistic. You think the very basic idea that when you're baptized, there's no distinction between Jew or Gentile, slave or free, man or woman. And so at the core of the church is this idea that this sacrament of baptism already washes away the man woman distinction. And there's a deep queerness to and kind of non-binary relationship to gender at the core of the tradition.
Hmm.
So she's living that out. And so like maybe take your cues from Haraway, everybody, and fight the conservative, climate denying, misogynistic side of the United States Catholicism kind of trend. So I don't know. Uh,
Okay, I love the generosity of this interpretation, and I think it's fantastic. Do you think that that much thought and intentionality and subterfuge went into it? Because
no.
I personally don't.
No, I
But I
don't.
like the extent that you're willing to give it. And
Well,
I
yeah.
guess my only rejoinder would be, well, I would have two questions. Again, with this hypothetical conversation we're having with the imaginary baby Jesuit and Donna Haraway, neither of whom are here, but that's fine. Um, one is a similar thing could be said of like Ivone Gabara, Heather Eaton, to
Yeah.
some degree Celia Dean Drummond, many others. And so, why
Yeah.
yeah,
Rosemary
again, is it
Ruther.
safer to cite someone who claims a sacramental stance but disavows an institutional stance in order not to have to invite in the possibilities of institutional reform?
Yeah. No, that's a good
So
point.
that's
Yeah.
that's that's one thing. Also, I wonder, I mean, we should just call her, get her on the phone. But I wonder if I was on an email exchange with her, and this was like an extremely amazing moment in my life. when she said that this thing was going to come out, and I was like, well, this is basically as good as getting tenure. Not really, it's different, it's ontologically different, but wow. Um, but I wonder if she would. I think this is a huge and amazing project to be done now, like Haraway Latour, Catholic anthropologies and ethics, um, and multi-species relations and so forth. We'll just say ontologies, because I don't know whether Donna Haraway would talk about living her life in a cruciform way, right? That's a very theologically infused way to think about it, and hers is much more that she has like these deep structures and ontological commitments to sacramentality and the radical consubstantiality of matter, uh, but not necessarily that that is formed in a cruciform way. And I say that because there are any number of philosophical and religious traditions that have similar kinds of ontological commitments, but without it being cruciform. And yet in the article, she also says that, she performed mass to her dolls growing up. So this is also, and in a way I cannot relate to because I didn't grow up Catholic. Um, she acknowledges what a force that was in her life. So obviously we just need to get her on spotlights.
Yeah, I'll try to reach out to her. And it's tough because it's one of those things where she might not admit publicly uh, a relationship to Catholicism beyond what she's already said about the sacramentalism, and it
Mm-hmm.
was very formative for her childhood, and so yeah, it's tough. I think sometimes we might not know to ourselves what religion we really practice, because I
Sure.
mean we're not fully transparent to ourselves. There's some kind of
Oh no.
unconscious
Mm-hmm.
dimensions and stuff, and so it'd be like, no, you're Catholic. She's like, no, I'm definitely not Catholic. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
your resistance to the institution is actually very Christian in a way, in the way that Jesus was resistant to some institutions that he was participating in and trying to change them and
Sam, I
fulfill them.
feel like growing up in Texas, you learned many skills of rhetorical deployments of theological argument.
Yeah, and that's part of it is that I really identify with Haraway in a lot of ways because of
Okay.
her complicated
Yeah,
relationship to Catholicism,
for
very
sure.
much. And yeah, when I was like 8 years old, and people were like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I said the Pope, and and then
Wow.
my parents were very nice about it, and were like, "Well, that's probably we're not probably going to see a Pope from the United States anytime soon." But geez, Pope Francis, first Pope from the Americas.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
at this point, I'm kind of ruling it out.
Well,
But it's,
factors.
yeah.
But that's it's thank you for the on I mean, I said that in jest, but also thank you for sharing that personal reflection because I've obviously sent this profile to a bunch of people today, and a couple different folks have written back with a wow, I'm so glad she was interviewed for this and they published it in this way because this describes my journey in so many ways. So many women, I think, will see themselves in this. And not, as you point out, not just women. It's not only a
Right.
gender binary situation, but it is, the untenability of ethics, institutional behaviors, and ethical questions, and then also this deep sacramentality, ritual, liturgical formation that is deeply, deeply meaningful to so many people. Yeah, I honor that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. To me, she's, spoken a little bit, pieces of, here and there, a sentence here and there about her relationship to Catholicism. But this
Mhm.
piece in the National Catholic Reporter was really the most uh, like thorough and consistent and deep I've heard her talk about her relationship to Catholicism.
Mhm.
So who knows what the imaginary baby Jesuit was thinking, or if it was even Pope Francis himself who's like, no, I read When Species Meet. It's a great book. Want to refer
Yeah,
to it. So
yeah,
who knows? But it's one of those kind of like a leverage point that I think could be really helpful in the future for getting people on board with Pope Francis's message. Because after all, he's not just talking to Catholics; he's talking to people of goodwill.
that's true.
And so,
That's a good
like, well,
point.
then mention an anti-Catholic person, and then some of these people who are like, yeah, I don't consider myself Catholic anymore, but I do consider myself a feminist or somebody who's into science
Hmm.
studies or any number of things. And if
Hmm.
Pope Francis is willing to welcome them in, then I feel like I can be part of that message too.
That's awesome. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm
we'll see.
I appreciate the positive skew interpretation because I tend to have my feminist hermeneutic of suspicion and be like, okay. Um, I did in response to an email to her say, wondered if the Anthropocene was going to get in there. I thought the Thulucene was a bridge too far to guess. So that wasn't in there either. Oh well.
Right.
Next time.
Yeah, it'll be in the next one. Yeah. That imaginary baby Jesuit's like, oh, I read the stuff on the Anthropocene and the Thulucene and Capitalocene, Plantationocene.
Well,
Get
and
that
they,
in
I
there.
mean, yeah, Capitalocene would have fit in there real well. I mean, Plantationocene, Catholic Church on colonialism, not so great. That's in the Beyond Laudato Si. We've got some stuff to talk
Oh,
about there.
nice.
Yeah.
Um, well, and when's that coming out? The Beyond Laudato Si?
So my hope is that it will come out possibly late 2024, but probably actually that's probably too early because my I'm going to submit it in March 2024.
Hmm.
Um, and then so it'll probably come out in spring-ish 2025, right in time for the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si,
Oh,
is the hope.
perfect.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's been fun to write. Once it took a while to get the structure going and just, you know, integrate many years of reflecting on this, but now we're
Right.
cranking.
I would imagine fun, but also frustrating. Uh,
Yeah.
because of exactly what Francis is talking about in the exhortation. Like, we're really not getting it done,
Yeah.
and still so much work to do, so much more trouble to stay with.
So much more trouble, but also so many good people doing good things. And my hope is that even when it comes from a very hierarchical, patriarchal, and in some ways top-down organization, the lifting up of activists and multilateralism from below is one more kind of authorization of, yeah, we need this, the world needs this. And I know that so many activists are doing such incredible work in ways that are feel thankless, for lots of reasons. Sharon Levine from Rise St. James, which is an organization that's been working in Cancer Alley, Louisiana for many years, was on a panel that I was on last week at Georgetown. I'll send the link. And she is amazing in the work that she and Rise St. James have been doing. But the entrenchment of politicians and economic powers and the influence of the Koch brothers, fossil fuel, plastics corporations, they are just so, so powerful. And so my hope is that there are ways for solidarity across movements to continue to amplify. And hopefully that, people who consider themselves really robust people of faith will take this seriously and say, yeah, these are life issues. But yeah, it's tough times for a lot of people who have the wisdom from below. So I'm happy to see the Pope giving them the shout out.
Yeah.
Credit where it's due.
Yeah. Beautifully said. I think that's a good note to end on. I like ending on something hopeful.
Yeah.
And I know, initially I was like, all right, I hate to take up your time. We talked to you just a few weeks ago, and so I said we'll keep it short to something like a half hour, and we both knew that that was a lie. So,
Yeah, but that's great. Like, what an amazing gift to be able to talk about these things extensively.
yeah, yeah,
And
that's true.
listeners can fast forward or listen on 2.5x if they want. That's cool.
That's true. That seems to be the trend. People really like listening to stuff sped up. I cannot do that.
I
It's,
yeah,
yeah, it
I can do
causes,
like 1.25, but
yeah,
that's kind of the max.
yeah, and even that's a little weird.
It
But
is.
yeah, over 1.5, I'm just like, nah, I'm having a panic attack. It's not good.
Don't do that. Yeah,
Don't do
don't do
that.
that.
But if you're listening to this and you want to do that, go for
Yeah, you do you.
it.
But
You do
Sam, you
you.
don't do that. I won't do that.
All right, geez, Christiana Zenner, such a pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for making time for us again, and thanks
Likewise,
to
Sam.
everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.